Hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College, where we're exploring Stonehenge, the most famous monument perhaps certainly in Britain, perhaps in the whole world of its type. And I'm calling this part 2, I'm calling this one Location, Location, Location. And that's for a very good reason, that the location of Stonehenge is itself very important. And we're going to explore that topic, and I'm going to be showing you other sites, some in Egypt, some in Mexico, that also have this connection with the sun and with particular days and calendars and things of this sort. So it's not an accident that we find this same thing happening with Stonehenge, because that's one of the things that people have been saying in the past is, well, you know, this alignment with the sun going down the axis of Stonehenge, well, it's just a chance, isn't it? It's just a fluke. And there it is, you know, they didn't really know what they were doing. Well, I think they knew very well what they were doing, and we're going to go into that in depth now. Now then, I've got a slide for you here which gives us the first phase of Stonehenge. They call it Stonehenge 1. There's actually 3 stages to the building of Stonehenge. And Stonehenge 1 was built, we believe, or archaeologists believe, and I take their word for it, circa 3100 BC. Now, as you'll discover as you progress with this work, that's a very important date in the calendars of many different places. So I think it's not unreasonable to think that something special happened at Stonehenge in 3100, or in Britain I should say, that led to the building of Stonehenge 1. Now, it's just basically an earth bank, a bank and ditch, and a circle with an earth bank. And in the ancient times, generally speaking, you would dig the bank, you would dig up a circle of earth and you put it on the inside so that if someone was attacking you, this is a hill fort, they've got more to climb up and a deeper hole to fall back down into. But with the sacred circle, they put the dirt the other side. So it's almost like you're putting the bank on the outside rather than on the inside. And that tells us that we're dealing with a holy site. We're dealing with something which was considered a sacred circle, a protected space, you might say, keeping something in rather than trying to keep something out. And within that circle, there's another circle of pits. They call them Aubrey holes. There was a guy called Aubrey who found this, I think, in the 17th century, maybe it was the 18th, I forget now. But there's 56 of these holes have been discovered. And that, again, seems to be quite important. And we'll come back to that a bit later on. But also in there's a square, or a rectangle, I should say, made by certain stones that were placed there. 2 of them inside their own little earth circle. That makes up what's called a station stone rectangle, and we'll get back to that too as we progress with this. So this was all Stonehenge 1, and you had the main axis of Stonehenge 1 even then pointing out towards the heel stone, or maybe just next to it. There's some debate now that there was a second heel stone, second stone next to the heel stone, and the actual axis would have been between the 2 of them. Now, because of certain movements of the sky, the sun appears to sit on top of the heel stone at sunrise. But before, shortly before that, it will actually be coming up to get on top of there. So we can imagine that, yes, there was a second stone, maybe even an archway on top. We don't know. But the sun would have shone down that axis. And it would do that on Midsummer's Day at dawn, as it does now. And you probably know that we have big gatherings at Stonehenge of Druids blowing and associated Druids in their robes, and then lots of people standing around taking photographs and wanting to be part of it. There used to be big hippie parties there back in the 70s and going into the 80s before they were banned. They had a huge free festival there. There'd be music, all sorts of big party. And that actually, funnily enough, seems to be much more in keeping with how Stonehenge was used back in the ancient times. They've actually discovered the remains at Durrington Walls as another huge earth bank where there seems to have been an encampment of people who would come there at the winter solstice and maybe the summer solstice as well. And they would have big banqueting feasts, and they would do certain rituals at Stonehenge, and who knows exactly what they were up to, but there are speculations about that. So this is Stonehenge 1, the first stage, and it gives us a lot of information in itself. And then a famous gentleman called Sir Norman Lockyer, who was an astronomer, a professor of astronomy actually. He started investigating not just Stonehenge, but also many other monuments, particularly in Egypt, and he went there to survey various places. And one of the places he would have gone to was the temple of Ramesses II at Abu Simbel, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of this temple. It was back in the, I think it was the 60s, maybe it was a bit earlier, even 50s, the 60s I think it was, that the Russians built a huge dam for the Egyptians on the Nile to conserve the water of the Nile so they could control the flood and feed the water out more evenly through the year, because throughout history Egypt has always had this problem with, do we get enough flood? We need plenty of water to flood the fields and put silts on the fields and so the crops will grow. On the other hand, we don't want so much that it floods everything and our houses and everything else. So they built this Nasser Dam at Abu Simbel. The Egyptians did, and because of the flooding of the Nile, or that part of the Nile, they had to raise the whole temple. They carved up the statues and everything into blocks and literally put it up on the cliff above where they were flooding. So you can still go to see Abu Simbel now. It was reconstructed with the same orientation as it had then, because they recognized that this was important for the significance of this big temple. And you can see here what's going on. At Midsummer's Day, the sun shines right along that passageway and illuminates the end of the temple, where there was a statue, I think. And so this was a solar temple built by Ramesses II, and to celebrate the sun god, who would be Horus the Elder. So this was an important site in Egypt, and Sir Norman Lockyer pointed this out. Now, he did other sites, but I won't go into those. A lot of those were to do with star alignments and such like, but we're not going into star alignments in this lecture. We might discuss those at some other time. Now, I want to take you to something else, and I want to show you here the map of the Earth laid out, and there's a band we can call the subtropical zone. And that stretches between the Tropic of Capricorn in the south up to the Tropic of Cancer in the north. So those are the two tropics, and the band between them is called the subtropical zone, and in the middle of that band you've got the equator. So this is a sort of equatorial zone between the tropics. And something very different happens with the sun and those latitudes. The location matters very much in those locations. And here you can see the temple of at Chichen Itza. They call it the Castillo. And you probably heard of this, but at certain days of the year, at the equinox, this temple is orientated exactly right, so that you see the wall here and the balustrade, and it's exactly right, so that the shadow cast by the corners of the wall, the nearest corner facing us, casts a shadow onto the balustrade. And you can see that shadow here. I've actually seen this myself. I've been there. I took this picture. You can see it's sort of a wiggly line goes down. And that's seen by people as representing a serpent. There's a big serpent head in stone at the bottom. So that's seen as the descent of the serpent. And they associate the serpent with the sun in Mexican mythology. So you can understand that this must have been very important to them, and it's quite amazing that they built this temple, the Castillo, exactly right for that shadow. And in fact, in all four sides there is a staircase. If I can go back to the previous slide, you can see this better. You have a staircase going up each side, and there are 91 steps on each side, so 4 times 91 makes 364, and then there's a 5th step to take you into the temple on top, making 365, which is the number of days in the year. So there's a lot of symbolism in this building itself. It's like a curled up serpent itself. The blocks of stone in the sides here, going up these steps, where you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 courses, you could say, of the climbing steps, or the big things going up there, and the blocks are facing on the sides of those steps. Not the staircase. I'm talking about the big steps. Are like snakeskins. So it's like a coiled up serpent is represented here by this temple. So there's a lot of information, a lot of connections and symbolism implied in this one building. And of course, that's just one building. There's many, many buildings in Mexico that go into all sorts of esotericism. Now here's another one. And again, I took this picture, and we're on one of the straight tracks that they have in the Maya lands. They call them the White Way. And we're walking towards, or the people there are walking towards, this building at the end, which is called the Temple of Dolls. I think they call it that because they found, when they were excavating it and investigating it, they found some dolls there. So they call it the Temple of Dolls, which is an odd name for it. But you can see the entrance quite clearly there on the temple at the end there, sort of a white piece there at the end. And that's so the sun can shine through at the equinox. And I was there on the equinox, and I was looking forward to seeing this, but it was a cloudy day, so we couldn't see it, which was very annoying. But it's a place called Zibil Baltun. I think I got that right. It's just a little to the north of Merida in the Yucatan. So if you want to go there and see this, that's where you have to go to. Zibil Chaltun. Yeah, Zibil Chaltun. It's just to the north of Merida in Mexico. And you can see the sun here shining through the doorway and also the two side windows, and they're like eyes. So this is an extraordinary sight, if you can catch it, to see this solar temple again arranged to the equinox, as was the Castillo at Chichen Itza. And Chichen Itza is not that far away from here. And it shines through the portal and along the white road. Again, as I say, we're in the subtropical zone, and that has other interesting facts to do with what's called zenith point astronomy, which only works for the sun in tropical locations. And what we're talking about here is if you're in the tropics, there are certain days in the year when the sun will pass directly overhead. That's what's called the zenith point. Now, where we live in Europe and many other places in the world outside of the tropical zone, you'll never see this because the sun never actually rises high enough in the sky to be exactly overhead. It's only in the tropics that you get this. And of course, on the day of the equinox in the tropics, if you happen to be standing on the equator itself, then that runs through, equatorial South America and equatorial Africa, and perhaps through Borneo or somewhere in the Pacific Ocean there, you will be able to see that if you are actually standing right on the equator. But in other parts of the tropics, you will see it on certain days because the sun continues moving north from the equator, going north. That's how it appears to us, until it reaches the Tropic of Cancer, and then it starts going south again until it gets to the Tropic of Capricorn. And in the more southerly zones beneath the equator, you will see the same thing happening as it goes further south. Not quite in South Africa, but you'll certainly see that in places like the Congo. So this is a very important thing that happens, and people have marked this in Mexico in particular, but also in other places, I believe. And the way they do this is with a standing stone. And here's one at Zibil Chaltun. This is also on that white road, and you can see the Temple of Dolls behind this standing stone on a platform. And this platform is like a miniature version of the Castillo we saw at Chichen Itza. You've got steps going up each side, and you've got a flat square platform on top, and you've got this vertical stone placed there. Now, that is there for is to cast shadows, and it's orientated with the staircase towards the four cardinal directions: north, south, east, and west. So the road here is running west to east. Actually, in the distance is east, and we're in the west of that. So it runs there, and then in the opposite direction, north-south. So it's square on with the cardinal points of the compass. Now that means that when the sun is passing to the south, it will cast a shadow to the north, which will be that direction, I think. Yes, that direction, to the left. But on certain days of the year, there's actually 2 days of the year, the sun will pass over this stone directly overhead, and it will cast no shadow at all. And those were very important days for the Mayas, particularly the second day that did that, which would be in August. And they would start their calendar for the new cycle, the new year, on that day when the sun passed over the stone, casting no shadow. And I've got another version for you here. The Maya used the second one of these to mark the start of the year. So too did the Aztecs, but on a different day from Jibel Chaltun. as the city of Tenochtitlan, that's the capital of the Aztecs, which is now Mexico City, was further north. So the further north you are, the later it's going to be after the equinox that you're going to get this effect for you to see. And here's another one of these platforms. You can see the platform itself rather better here. This one, again, I took this picture, it's at Palenque, which is in Mexico, in Chiapas region. And you only got the remains of what would have been the tall standing stone. I couldn't find anything in the literature to talk about this, which is very strange, because it's one of the most obvious features. This is their sundial, their clock for the year. So they would have used, again, the standing stone here, and they would see when there's no shadow, and that will tell them this is the day, the New Year's Day. And they'd have festivals and parties, probably sacrifice some people. I'm sorry, the Maya did that as well as the Aztecs. Not as much, but they certainly did. And they'd have parties and whatever to celebrate this major festival of the sun. And here you see something rather different. And this is at a place called Monte Alban, which is in Oaxaca in Mexico. Monte Alban is a wonderful site if you can go there to Oaxaca. It's a sort of more, would we call it to the west or south from the Maya lands? I think so. Lovely town, lovely sort of Spanish colonial villas, and I stayed with my wife. We stayed in a converted convent that had been turned into a hotel. It was a lovely place with flowers growing in the courtyard, which would have been the cloister in the old days, I suppose. But you've got this mountain behind. Monte Alban means white mountain. And there's fantastic ruins there, very large area actually. And there's a particular temple there among the ruins, and I think it's Zapotec. The Zapotecs are another tribe, and they arranged things so that they would have a beam of light would pass down a vertical shaft and illuminate inside this one building to tell them when it was the day. So you can imagine there would be someone in there waiting for the moment, and the sun would pass directly overhead and shine down that shaft, and they would be able to say, right, time to start the party, and they would get going. Now the Egyptians did something rather similar. They didn't. When we were in Egypt, you're too far north, except right down the very far south, you bang on the Tropic of Cancer. You're able to take a place called Siwa. No, not Siwa. I can't think of its name at the moment. Anyway, they filmed. They worked out the day when the sun would pass directly over a well. There was a Greek scholar called Eratosthenes, and he had the idea of measuring the length of Egypt and then using that to work out the circumference of the whole earth. And the way he was able to do that, they knew the length of Egypt, they'd measured it. But there was a well in Syene, right in the south of the country, under the Tropic of Cancer. And he was living in Alexandria. And in Syene, the sun would pass directly overhead and shine down vertically down this well, just as it did in Mexico we were talking about, but only on that one day, the summer solstice. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, he could measure the height of the sun as seen from Alexandria. From that, he could work out how many degrees of the circle Egypt occupied, which is roughly 7 degrees, I think it's 7.25. And from that, he could calculate the length of the circumference of the entire Earth. And it's fairly accurate. We can do it better now. And he didn't know that the Earth is a flattened sphere slightly. He was the first, we think, to work out what the circumference of the Earth was. But who knows? There's so much of what was written in antiquity that we just don't know. The writings haven't survived. So that was a big achievement. On the place in Egypt where the astronomers lived and worked, the chief of the astronomers, or chief of the watchers, it's now a suburb of Cairo called Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Heliopolis is at latitude 30 degrees. That's why it's important. It's at latitude 30 degrees. And this location is special. At the equinox, the sun is at the point where the ecliptic crosses the celestial equator, right? The ecliptic is the circuit that the sun follows through the sky. And the celestial equator you can think of as a projection of our Earth's equator onto the bigger circle we call the celestial sphere. We imagine all the stars stuck on the inside of a giant sphere, and our Earth sphere turned, or in the old days they thought that the Earth sphere was sitting still and the celestial sphere was going round it, rotating round it. And because the Earth is not lined up pole to pole with the equator and the celestial sphere, but it's inclined to the ecliptic, you get the seasons and you get longer and shorter days. You probably know all that. I'm not going to go into it. But at the equinox, the sun is positioned, as I said earlier, on the equator. The days are equal length because it's on the equator. And because the Heliopolis is at 30 degrees north, the sun will appear to be at 60 degrees of angle. We call that altitude in astronomy. It'd be at an altitude of 60 degrees. So that means it will cast a shadow which gives this triangle, the 1/2√3 triangle, with a 60 degree angle at the bottom and a 30 degree angle at the top, and a right angle, at the base there, where the obelisk is connected. So that's a very special triangle. So for the Egyptians to have the sun god, Ra or Re, casting a shadow that gives this exact proportion of the 1/√3 in their country, in their holy place, was very important to them. It signified a blessing. So we can understand that for this reason, if for no other, the Egyptians would believe that their country was in some way a holy land. Now, I haven't forgotten about Stonehenge. We will come back to that. But I've got a couple more things I need to show you first. First of all, Giza too has a solar monument. And this is the pyramid of Khafra, or Khafre. And I took a party of people there in the year 2000 to observe the summer solstice sun. And as the sun passes, it rises further north than east in summertime, and it comes up, and as it rises, it will come to a certain altitude in the sky, and there in Giza, it's just at the right altitude as it crosses the east-west axis. They call this the primary vertical in astronomy. It crosses that, and it's exactly at the right altitude to sit on top of this pyramid. It's the central pyramid of Giza. So if you can ever manage it, if you can be in Egypt at the summer solstice, and believe me, it's very, very hot, then. So if you don't like the heat, I wouldn't go there. But you would see the sun, if you are there at the right time, and it's about, I think it was around about 10 past 10 or something like that, it will sit on top of the pyramid. And at that moment, before it, we were there much earlier than that, and there was a shadow being cast by the pyramid, big triangular shadow. But as the sun rose higher and higher, so the pyramid kind of ate its shadow. You could almost see the shadow receding into the pyramid. And exactly at the moment when it's sitting right on top, you look up the side of the pyramid and you can see the sun. So it's, I think this celebrated the victory of light over dark as one of the purposes of this. But there was something else that would have impressed the Egyptians mightily. Here you can see how the shadow disappears. This is a block here. There's not too many of the facing stones left, but there are a few. And you can see on this one, the slope of it is the slope of the pyramid, and you can see how the shadow has been eaten up as the sun sits on top of the pyramid. And the slope of the Khafra pyramid is determined by a 3-4-5 triangle. I'm sure you've come across the 3-4-5 triangle in your time when you did geometry. And you would know Pythagoras' theorem. The square of the hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. So if you take 3 and 4, the other two sides, a height of 4, 3 squared is 9, and 4 squared is 16. 9 plus 16 is 25. So the square of the square root of 25 is 5, and that gives you the hypotenuse. Hence the 3-4-5 triangle. Now I think for the Egyptians, the fact that the pyramid would do this on Midsummer's Day with a 3-4-5 triangle would have been fantastic. That would have been amazing, you know. And whoever discovered this first, that's why they built this pyramid this way, and it's why I think it's the central pyramid of the three. They all belong to a set plan. Now, we're coming back to the British Isles, and it's now known that New Grange, the most important Neolithic site in Ireland, was a passage tomb, probably for the royal family who ruled over the area. There were a number of skeletons inside the New Grange which they found, and they were able to do DNA tests, and they found that they're related. So you have to think, when you have a big tomb like this, not just anyone gets a tomb like that, it's royalty. So this would have been the, what in archaeological language, high status individuals. I would call them probably the royalty, the king and queen and their family. And it's built around 3200 BC, which would be about 100 years before Stonehenge 1. So something was going on in Ireland already. Well, we know things were going on in Britain as well, but this very significant tomb was built around then. And if you go there, you find there's a big block on the outside with these spirals on the outside, which seem to represent energy vortices or something of that sort. And the three linked together, the sort of Holy Trinity. And that is probably the real reason why the Shamrock in Ireland has such a big place. They say St. Patrick picked a shamrock and said, you know, this is the Father, the Son and the Holy Ghost, the symbol by the shamrock. But I think probably in Ireland they already had, an idea of Trinity going way back, long before then. And above this stone, there's a window. You can see it there on this picture in the doorway. And on the winter solstice, the sun shines through that doorway all the way down into the chamber, right up to the end. So again, we have this idea of the solstice being celebrated with light, the emergence of the new light and the start of a new year. This has been very important in these northern locales, Britain and Ireland. When you're in midwinter, you can't grow anything, and you're having to live off what you stored previously, supplemented by a bit of hunting probably. So to see the light coming back would be a big event. And we still have that with Christmas. That's really what Christmas is all about. It's the birth of the new light, which is symbolic of Jesus Christ again as well. And that's why we celebrate his birthday then, the birth of the new light, the light of the world. Now then, I want to come to someone very important who's ignored almost entirely by archaeology today, and that's this gentleman, Gerald Hawkins. And I've got his book here. Where have I put it? And Gerald Hawkins was an astronomer. He was British, but he's lived in America nearly all his life, so he had American citizenship, but he still regarded himself as British. And he was in England in the 50s, and he was at Porton Down, where they were experimenting on rockets. And Porton Down is not far from Stonehenge. So in his free time, he used to go to Stonehenge, and he started thinking about this and the orientation with the sun. And he got the idea of investigating all the other orientations of the different portals. You imagine that you've got that circuit of standing stones with lintels on top, and each one is a doorway. And he was thinking, well, I wonder if other things are linked with that. And he did a lot of investigation, and he was working with one of the early computers. I think it was an IBM 370 or something like that, and got a friend of his who was a programmer to program in the orientations and work out the sky as it would have been at that time of year, or maybe he did that bit himself, to see if there are correlations between the positions of the sun and moon with certain days of the year, other than, as well as the main one going down the axis. And he wrote a book called Stonehenge Decoded. And that caused an absolute sensation when it came out. I think about 1966, or maybe it was a bit earlier than that. But it caused an absolute sensation. I remember reading this book around that time and being absolutely amazed. Why hadn't anyone thought about this? And that actually is what triggered the new interest in Stonehenge, which culminated with all these hippies congregating at Stonehenge to watch the sunrise and so on. That was really triggered initially by Gerald Hawkins' book, Stonehenge Decoded. Now, one of the things he found out, first of all, was about this station stones rectangle. His first focus of attention on the so-called station stones. These four stones are deliberately placed in the circle of the Aubrey holes. The Aubrey holes, I think, maybe held blue stones, the smaller stones you see at Stonehenge, which have been moved around a number of times and put into different places at different times in history. Or they might have been used for wooden poles. There was other places in Britain where it was, they used to put up wooden poles around a circle. He had the idea that perhaps they didn't hold anything at the time, and they were just holes with a flat surface. And he believed that the holes were used for calculating eclipses, and that was another thing I'll come back to. But at the station stones, he discovered that the shorter sides of the rectangle, of course, pointed to the midsummer sunrise, but also the midwinter sunset in the other direction. So you had sunrise and sunset with those, but the horizontals pointed towards positions of the moon. And you can see that better on here. So the red lines I put is the solar lines of the sun at the summer solstice and the winter solstice, and then you have the moon positions. That you have to understand that the sun and moon don't always rise in the same place in the sky. You know, you're taught the sun rises in the east. Well, sort of. It rises in the east at the equinox because it's on the equator, the celestial equator. But during the summertime, or from the spring and summer, it first of all goes further north, and you would see the sun rising further north as the year progresses up to the solstice, which would be the extreme position, and then it starts to rise going back south again, and then it will, at the autumn equinox, it will start moving in the opposite direction. It will start moving south of east more and more, and it rises. The further north it rises, the longer the day, because it rises there and then it's going to set right round here in the southwest, in that direction. You're going to have the sun in the sky for a long time and rising quite high up. So that gives you the nice weather in the summertime. But in the wintertime, it rises much further south. And you get just sun, the day is much shorter. And here in Britain, certainly in southern Britain, it goes from about 16 hours of sunshine, or the sun above the horizon in summertime, in midsummer, to about 8 hours in wintertime, at midwinter. So it's a big difference in the time scales. So this would have been noted, and the moon does the same thing with its cycle. It's a more complicated thing to work out, but the moon has extreme positions, north and south, that it rises, and they don't correspond to the year, of course. They correspond to the position the moon is in its own cycle. So that the extreme positions when you have a full moon or a crescent moon would have been noted by the astronomers of the day, and that seems to have been what the station stone rectangle was all about, was to mark out both the directions of the moon, extreme positions, and the positions of the sun. And I think Stonehenge is pretty much unique in this sense of combining the two cycles in this way, in this extraordinary manner. And again, it's a bit like in Egypt, where they regard their country as a holy land because, it gives the 60-degree angle at Heliopolis and the sun would sit on the Khafre pyramid. Here in Britain, we don't get those, but we do get the situation at Stonehenge is just at the right latitude, location, for the positions of the moon and sun to form a rectangle. Go elsewhere and that rectangle will become more diamond-shaped rather than being, squared off at the corners. So this again is an important consideration. So, using the computer, Hawkins discovered that all four sides of the rectangle pointed towards extreme positions of the moon's rising and settings. Also, one of the diagonals, so you had these positions of the moon and a diagonal as well, marking out the positions. It was therefore clear that Stonehenge combined both solar and lunar astronomy in its earliest expression, as Stonehenge 1, from circa 3100 BC, And this was some 500 years before the pyramids of Giza were built. Well, that's certainly what archaeologists regard. They think the pyramids of Giza are built around 2,500, in that ballpark. But, well, there's a lot of people disagree with that, but we won't go into that argument at the moment. So Hawkins produced a schematic that incorporates the Starson stone ring and tall trilithons of Stonehenge 3. So you can see it's quite a complex diagram he produced here. And it shows how Stonehenge 3 was designed and preserved to preserve most of the sighting lines of Stonehenge 1 while adding some more accurate ones. And he published the full table of sightings directions for Stonehenge 3. So there's a whole table. I'm not going to investigate that here, but he published this whole table, and his book is, it's very readable, but it's also very, very good science. This guy was no idiot, and he was a mathematician and an astronomer, and able to calculate these things when most archaeologists have done arts degrees rather than science. They've been classic scholars, or certainly in those days they would have been. So they didn't buy this at all. They didn't like it. They didn't like it one bit. And especially when he came up with his analysis of the Aubrey rings and the icing of a very rich cake, he showed how the 56 Aubrey holes could have been used as a primitive computer for predicting eclipses. So, not only does he talk about alignments to the sun and moon, but he's saying these supposedly barbaric savages knew about eclipses, and they knew about the metonic cycle, that's sort of roughly 18, 19 years, that predicts when you're going to get the next eclipse, not necessarily in the same place. And you could predict more, there would be more often you would get eclipses of the moon. Occasionally you might get an eclipse of the sun. But here in Britain, there's no guarantee at all that you're going to see it, even if one happens, because our weather is such that it can be cloudy. So they didn't like this at all. They thought he was being balmy, thinking these primitive savages who, hunter-gatherers or whatever they were, could have thought of this. I think people are more respectful of our ancient ancestors these days. The archaeologists come on a long way in Britain. We now know that they were into animal husbandry, they were growing crops, widespread crops, especially in this area. And we now know also that the people coming for these feasts in Durrington Walls and Stonehenge area were coming from all over the country. So it wasn't just a local thing that was going on here. There was a centralized conception that this was the holy place to go to on pilgrimage, perhaps, at the solstices. And also there are mentions in Greek texts, I forget who it was wrote about it, but they talk about how in Hyperborea in Britain there was a temple of Apollo being the sun god in Greece. So this must have been what they were talking about, the temple of Apollo in Britain. It must have been Stonehenge that they were talking about. But that, again, is another story. So this is all too much for the archaeologists of his day. He was ridiculed and his work was almost entirely ignored. About the only thing that has been accepted is that the station stones were intended to mark the extreme points of the moon cycle as well as the solstices. So that bit, I think, has got through, but a lot of his work is just ignored totally. And I was looking through, I have a lovely book. I'll show you. Yes, I went to the Age of Stonehenge exhibition at the British Museum. It's a couple of years ago now. And and it was a fantastic exhibition. I've went there 3 times, and I could have spent much more time in there studying this. But they had a lovely book that they published, The World of Stonehenge. And there you can see on the front of it, it's the Nebra disc, which actually comes from Germany, but that was on display at the exhibition, which was very interesting to have a look at. But in here, there's not one mention of Hawkins. You know, I would have thought he would have deserved at least a mention, but his name's not even mentioned, and I think that's a crying shame. Of course, he's passed on long ago now, but his book was seminal. It's a seminal work, and I do recommend, if you can find a copy, you'd probably get it on the internet, you probably get it on Kindle but these days, but worth reading. So very sadly, Gerald Hawkins does not get the acclaim he deserves for being the first person to use computing power to ascertain the true alignments of Stonehenge with both sun and moon. In modern textbooks on the archaeology of Stonehenge, he barely gets a mention, if at all. As it happens, these alignments with both the sun and moon are the most important fact about Stonehenge. Only at this latitude, 51 degrees, 10 minutes, 44 seconds, with a leeway of 30 miles north or south, are these solar and lunar alignments at right angles to each other. So there's a bit, you know, you can go a bit further north and a bit further south, and you'll still get that. Well, you know, where is the exact right angle? Perhaps just here in the middle. It's again his sense of location. The location of Stonehenge is important, and we need to take that on board because it means that somehow or other people knew that. And it's clear that the area of Salisbury Plain was a sacred landscape. That Stonehenge stands in Salisbury Plain. And Salisbury is the English equivalent of Salug, which we now call Old Sarum. And Sal is a variant on Sol, or Sil, or Sul, and they all mean the sun. So Salisbury really means the town of the sun. That's what Salisbury means. Sulis, if you spell it with a U, would mean of the sun. And Bury means a borough or bury, usually a hill fort or a town on top of a hill. And Old Sarum is on top of a hill. The old Salisbury is on top of a hill. It was a hill fort originally. So the fortress of the sun, or the hill fort of the sun, is what Salisbury means. And this whole area, including Salisbury itself, was inside the sacred area associated with Sol. It would seem that in some special way, Stonehenge was a temple that combined commemoration of the dead with celebrating the living. Was this site selected by ancient astronomers, or was it just a coincidence? So if you talk with archaeologists, they're very cagey. They like to talk in generalities. They don't like to get too specific about things, especially things that are controversial. They always have to be looking over their shoulder. One of my colleagues is going to think, if I say this, I better not, put my head above the parapet or get chopped off. So they like to talk in generalities about beaker folk, or, perhaps something or other. One's tempted to think that if they're going to say something controversial. One's tempted to think that the ancient Britons knew about the extreme positions of the moon, would be the nearest they would go to acknowledging that. We had this, Robert Bovell and I, when we were talking about the Orion mystery with archaeologists or Egyptologists. They don't like to put their head above the parapet. The most they would say was things like, "Oh, you're looking at the stellar theory of the pyramids. No one's done that for a while." that's about the nearest you'll get to acknowledging that it was something interesting. However, I rather think it was down to some kind of psychic guidance. Something perhaps even unconscious guided them, that's the ancient Britons, to this spot to build the first Stonehenge. So one of the arguments used against these ideas is that they would have to have followed and measured things for a long time to work it all out. And, do you really think they didn't have a written language? How would they have done this? They were primitive. How would they have worked these things out? They didn't have our modern instruments and telescopes and like that. Well, I think they were guided. You read in the Bible about various prophets and people are told by God, you come and speak to them. Well, I think that kind of clairvoyance, that kind of psychic connection with higher mind, is how I would put it, it's not something new. It's not something that is new today, and it's not something that there would have been people here in Britain who were psychics of one sort or another, and they could be guided. And their intuition and their psychic overself, higher mind, whatever you like to call it, God, could guide them and say, right, go to this point here. That's where you've got to build a temple. That's where you've got to build a nice circle, please. And, arrange these 4 stones and lining up in this way. I think that's probably how it happened. I don't think they were using instruments to work all this out. So, however, like Giza and other sacred sites in the world, it developed to become a national shrine. And it still is in a way today. Yeah, people are still going to Stonehenge at the summer solstice. It's a big deal. And as long as those stones are there, it's going to be, people are going to continue going there. And I should be going there hopefully at the end of the month. I'm going to be in Salisbury at the end of the month. So I'll try and make sure that my wife and I will go and have another look at Stonehenge. We've been there many times before, but now they've closed the road and they've changed everything. I look forward to having a look to see how it is now. They got rid of the old car park, and apparently it's more in keeping with the landscape now. So we'll see, and I'll let you know when I come back. So thank you very much. As I say, the location of these holy sites is often very important in itself. But we're going to go into much more about Stonehenge. We're going to look at patterns, and we're going to examine the esoteric position of Stonehenge from different points of view as we progress in this study. So thank you very much, and we'll speak again.